I'm very pleased to introduce our next guest. I'll take the liberty and say it's a contrast to Fred. Lizzie is a nice young woman, and, you know, Fred is Fred. Lizzie Simon is the author of Detour, My Bipolar Road Trip in 4D, and it was published in 2002. Since publication, Lizzie has appeared on many prominent TV, newspaper, magazine, and radio and web outlets. HBO Films optioned Detour for a feature film. Since writing Detour, Lizzie has been recognized nationally as a leading advocate for people with mental illness. In the past 6 years, Lizzie has been a frequent guest lecturer on the subject of mental health at universities and mental health organizations. Lizzie also developed an educational forum with Dr. Gary Sachs from Harvard University and Massachusetts General Hospital. Lizzie has a regular column in BP, a magazine for bipolar disorder for folks, and has published several pieces about bipolar disorder, and she also blogs for Psychology Today. Lizzie grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, and graduated from Columbia with a BA in history in 1998. While at Columbia, she was head of the arts department at WKCR, and for 2 years was the creative producer at the Flea Theater in Tribeca, where she produced and promoted over 14 full-scale productions, including 2 Obie Award-winning shows, 50 concerts, and the works of over 30 choreographers. She is currently teaching memoir writing and working on a book about PTSD called The Soldier's Heart. Please join me and give a warm welcome to Lizzie Simon.
Hi. How's everybody doing? I was so pleased to get to hear Fred speak. He's so much funnier than I would ever expect him to be. That was really excellent. I just want to first thank the family whose name is very difficult for me to pronounce correctly, the Nadherny Calciano family, who I had the opportunity to meet last night, for putting this symposium on with the Dominican Hospital and with the help of George Jarrow, who I also want to thank. This symposium makes so much sense, and it's first on so many levels. It was put together so intelligently, and it's really an honor to get to be part of their family's attempt to make meaning in the world again. And so I'm very pleased to be here. Today, I was brought in part through my work with Active Minds. I don't know how many of you know the organization Active Minds, but it was started at UPenn by a woman named Alison Malman. When she was a junior at UPenn, her brother died by suicide, and she started a group at her school for students who wanted to talk about mental health issues. And now, there I am. That was really scary. Anyhow, now there are chapters, there are Active Minds chapters on nearly 250 campuses nationwide, so this is 9 years later. And so it's a wonderful organization to be a part of. It's a totally different generation, even than my own. I went to college, 15 years ago. And it's really exciting to work with these young people who are truly changing the conversation about mental health. Active Minds brought me on to work with their Speakers Bureau. I'm in the Speakers Bureau, but I also train the speakers. And I wanted to share a little bit about what we do when we go into schools and talk to young people about mental health. We go into high schools and colleges. First of all, we talk about mental health as a spectrum. We ask kids what they think of when they hear the words mental health, and they typically say things like, Paris Hilton or Britney Spears, or a sort of garden variety of people floridly going insane as as dramatically as possible in front of as many cameras as possible. But we talk about the spectrum. We talk about how, yes, there are people with mental disorders, but that mental health encompasses a whole lot more than mental disorders. That mental health is about topics like getting enough sleep, that it's about stress, about getting into college, that it's about the stress of your parents not getting along or getting divorced. We talk about how mental health is a whole lot more than the lack of mental disorders. And we work to define with them what it means to have mental health. And so I always share that, to me, it's interesting too, after listening to Fred, because he talked about this in a very different way, but I think of mental health as a freedom. I think of it not as the freedom to be crazy, but as the freedom to be well, that it's a freedom that that I need to do the kind of work I want to do in the world, to live the life that I want to have in the world, and to have the relationships that I want to have in the world. And as a freedom, it's worth working towards. And that work that we talk to students about, most of our focus, again, we're not just focusing on kids who have mental disorders who are in the audience, we're talking to all of them about coping mechanisms. And I'll get to that a little bit later. My own story starts in high school. I was diagnosed in high school anyway with bipolar disorder. And there are aspects of my story that are really quite typical of my own generation of young people getting diagnosed with these disorders. And in some ways it's not typical. I had episodes of depression and mania as a kid. My dad's a doctor, my grandfather is a surgeon. Certainly they were educated about mental health, but I think that they didn't want to saddle me with a diagnosis, and they didn't want to rush to think that there was anything terribly wrong with me. I think they just thought I was very emotional, and when I was manic, they thought I was perhaps, going to be a creative genius one day. So, things sort of plodded forward. They did send me to a therapist as a kid, but I remember, one of the earliest interventions was when I was about 8 years old, and I was told I was going to a therapist, and I thought that meant getting in trouble. And so when I got to the therapist and she started talking to me, I think she was trying to find out if I had been sexually molested, which I hadn't been. I told her that my mom just didn't pay enough attention to me. And my mother was, an 80s working mom. Both my parents worked my whole life. And so that answer worked for the therapist and worked into my mother's guilt. And so my mother promptly took me sledding like the next weekend. And we were there for about 10 minutes when I saw a girlfriend of mine, and I ditched my mother, and she said, "What are you doing? I thought you wanted to spend time with me." And I said, "No, I just said that to get out of therapy." And so that's another thing we tell young people, is that it's not enough to go to therapy. You actually have to tell the truth when you get there, or else it's not going to work. But the depression that I felt or really suffered was as a little kid. And even at 5, I have journal entries about being suicidal. And I had we had a pretty happy family, so there wasn't anything real to be suicidal about. The suffering that I had, maybe 10% of the time throughout most of my childhood, as soon as I got into high school, it was more like 60% of the time, 65, 70% of the time. And I really was waking up most mornings miserable. And I was anxious most of the time. I really hated high school. Did anyone else here hate high school? Yeah. It's really funny because to this day, there are people in my high school who try and get you to go to reunions and such, and it's really hard. Like, as evolved as I like to think I am, I still am not ready to make peace with my high school. I really blamed the high school for what was going on with me, and I think my parents on some level did too. And they thought that if you took a kid who was dealing with a lot of depression and anxiety and you just put them somewhere else, then that might do the trick. And so they sent me to Paris for my senior year of high school. And actually, as it turns out, Paris is a bit of an antidepressant. I really had a nice time there. I really liked living there. I had really great friends. I mean, it was true that the people in my high school were pretty snobby and sort of cliquey. So it was pretty great to be around these sophisticated, global. I had one girlfriend in Paris who called herself a global nomad because her father they had taken them to different countries every 2 years of her life, and I thought they were like the coolest kids I'd ever been friends with in my life, and they were, and I was really happy there. I was very independent. I was excited every morning to wake up, which to me was such a relief after the depression and anxiety I'd been having in high school for years at that point. And then I got into college, and again, this should have been the happiest day of my happy life at that point. I'd worked really hard to get into college, and I got in early. And to a 17-year-old, that's like basically, the get out of jail free card for life. You know what I mean? At that age, you just feel like, oh, I got into college, I have nothing else to worry about ever again, which isn't true, but at the time, that's what it signified. And yet the next day, like almost immediately, I started to feel weird. And I went home for the Christmas holidays, and I got home and I just couldn't function. I was sleeping all the time. I was crying when I was awake. I had that kind of circular, closed, excruciating anxiety of a depressed person. And it really, to my parents, I think for the first time, made sense that there was something wrong with me. Because my external circumstances didn't match what was going on for me internally, they knew that something needed to be done professionally. And so they took me to a doctor. And this is sort of typical. The doctor took one look at me, basically, and saw a depressed person and diagnosed me with depression, which would be fine, except that, as most of you know, the medications used for depression are not always the medications used for bipolar disorder. And in fact, the one that I was put on has since been found to cause a high incidence of suicidality in teenagers and cause psychosis in some teenagers, and that's what happened to me. I went back to Paris. I was living there with friends of the family, but I was basically unmonitored. I was pretty mature for my age, and I begged to go back because I did not want to be stuck in Providence. I still sort of blamed my high school for what was going on. And when I got back to Paris, the depression lifted because the medication I was on was doing its job. But a few days into it, I was already manic, and I wasn't sleeping. I was staying up all night. I was talking very quickly, wouldn't shut up. And then I would say about a week and a half into it, I started to be psychotic. And that's not typical. I think that happened to me because I'd had a terrible response to a medication. But that is what happened to me, and I was psychotic in Paris, and I thought that the CIA was after me, and I saw people with microphones coming at me from around the different corners, and I saw microphones in the ceiling, and at a certain point, and I can't explain this, I became a cat. And it's interesting, I just spoke to a high school, 815-year-olds at once. It's a really interesting thing to do. And they had so many questions about being a cat. What was that like? I mean, that was really all I wanted to talk about. What color cat? And did you have 4 legs? And anyhow, I was a cat. If you have questions about it, I can answer more. But basically, just trust me on this. I was a cat. And I only remember scattered flashes of that whole psychotic episode, but what eventually happened is that I was sent back home to Providence, and that plane ride was really the scariest, most awful, 6 or 7 hours of my life. It should be said that, thank goodness this was 15 years ago, and not recently, because over the past few years there have been several instances of people being shot, killed. They were mistaken for terrorists when in fact they were having psychotic breaks on airplanes, because we have this, hysteria about terrorism. It's really, there have been quite a few cases. I don't know what the stewardesses thought of me at the time, but I know that I remember that I thought everyone on the plane was wearing my clothing. I thought they were holding my belongings, my journals. In fact, the only thing I brought with me was my journals. It was the only thing. I thought I was escaping some kind of revolutionary blah, blah, blah. I was still really psychotic. And I thought, when I went to the bathroom, for instance, that there was microphones in the bathroom and a video camera in the toilet broadcasting me peeing on the airplane movie screen. So like, you know how when you're on an airplane you watch the movie, so when I got out of the bathroom, I really let everyone on the plane have it because they had humiliated me. And I have no idea what the perception was of all the other people on the plane. It must have been sort of scary for them too, but I was truly terrified. And we landed in Boston. I went through customs. There was on the customs card, you know, they say male or female when you fill it out. I wouldn't fill it out because there was no card for cats to fill out. Again, I don't know how I got through, but you know, my grandmother picked me up and took me home, and I was properly diagnosed with bipolar disorder. As it turns out, my grandfather had bipolar disorder. He was a successful surgeon in Rhode Island, but he couldn't tell anybody about it because it was a different generation, and he feared that if anyone knew that he was a surgeon with bipolar disorder, that he wouldn't get any work. And so in that weird way, we never fully got the proper family history out when it was time for me to be diagnosed. I think for my parents, at that point when I was home and I was properly diagnosed and they gave me medications to bring me out of the psychosis, I think they hoped that things were sort of over, that I was safe, that I had somehow made it through. And here's another sort of atypical part of my story. I was put on a medication, I was put on lithium, but of course you all know, right, that different medications work differently for different people, and I'm in no way endorsing one medication over another, but I had a very good response to it. In fact, within days I was kind of normal in the sense that I could have a conversation, I could put my clothes on, I could carry about things in the day. And I think, again, my parents really hoped that things were over, that I was safe back home, that something horrible had happened, sure, but that the story, a new story could begin. And that's true. I went to college. I was, from the outside, a very normal, certainly a normal-looking college student. I got really involved with the college radio station. By the time I graduated, I had a 4.0 my senior year of college. I was, fast-tracked into a career, a really exciting career as a theater producer in downtown Manhattan. But it wasn't over for me. It really took a while, actually, for it to be truly over, for that part of my life to really be over. And that's because there's an awful lot of things that medication just can't cure, right? It can't cure shame. It can't cure the fear that it would happen again. That was my biggest fear, that's what my life was going to be, is a series of profound interruptions where everything would change immediately and I would be a psychotic mess. It couldn't help me, medication couldn't help me with my fear that my future was drastically limited by this new diagnosis. It couldn't help me with the loneliness that I felt, and a loneliness that was only perpetuated by my fear of disclosing to people what had really happened or what was really true for me. It couldn't help me with my deep, profound mistrust and anger towards practically everything and everybody. I was angry at doctors, I was angry at my parents, I was angry at what seemed to be normal, all the normal kids around me who seemed to have it so easy. I was angry at men, I was angry at women, I was just angry. And medication can't really do anything about that. And it couldn't help me figure out how I was going to perceive my own identity in a culture that for hundreds of years has had enormous stigma about having bipolar disorder. And so I think Detour, when I wrote Detour, it was really out of all of that stuff, very much like the family that organized this symposium, that kind of motivation. And I bet most of you who work in the mental health field share this kind of motivation. You just know what was missing for you or for someone you loved, and you want to create that in the world. there's a quote by Alice Walker, "I write the things I should have been able to read." And that for me has been kind of the main motivation behind my writing and behind my advocacy work. Detour started, I was on the subway one day on my way to the theater going to work, and I saw a poster, and it was a public health campaign by the New York Department of Health and Hygiene, mental hygiene, one of my favorite mental health phrases. And it showed real people in real jobs. Also going back to what Fred said about opportunities for, how did he put it? Dignified opportunities to contribute. So it was posters of real people, and it said, for people with mental illness, treatment is working. It was portraits of working New Yorkers, and it had a huge impact on me. This is why, doing work, collecting role models for people has always been my passion, because it really was, for me, as a kid, if you showed me that it was possible in one person, I figured that I could do it, that I could figure it out myself. I just needed to see it once, or a few times. I just needed to identify with somebody a few miles down the road from me in my own journey, and then I could figure out how to get myself there. And that's what this poster campaign did to me on my subway, on my way to work. And I remember I got there, and it was like, boom, I knew the book that I wanted to write. I wanted to travel the country. I wanted to collect testimonies from people who had bipolar disorder but were living well. I didn't want to talk to anybody who had ruined their lives. I didn't want to talk to people who were still struggling. I wanted to find role models. It was for me, and it was for other kids like me. And I wanted to put all the voices in one place and publish it. And that's what Detour became. It gave me the time and space to address all of that stuff that I mentioned before, the shame and the fear and the loneliness. I could ask these people about how they had handled it, what were their perspectives, and in a post-traumatic reality, it's really important to find people who can help you build a new worldview, who can help you figure out how to make meaning from this destroyed sense of meaning. And that's really what that trip was. I am enormously grateful that I was able to publish it, and it's very gratifying to get letters. I still get letters, even though it was published many years ago. I still get letters almost every day from people who have read it and have used it in their work or in their homes. And there are colleges, actually Harvard is using it in their psychiatry department, which is very smart of them. And so, go Harvard. In any case, since the book was published, I wrote it about 10 years ago. It was published about 7 years ago. And over the last 10 years, I've been able to certainly build a kind of toolbox of coping mechanisms. And that's really what we talk about when the Active Mind speakers go into schools, is getting kids to think about, what are they doing to cope now? What are the sort of natural things that they do to cope? Which ones do they want to keep, and which ones do they want to discard, and which ones do they want to build sort of into their own toolbox? We ask them, and I can ask all of you, when was the last time that you felt really disappointed or betrayed or let down, or you felt really lost or unchosen? What did you do in the weeks after? What did you do? What were the things that you actually did? What were the things that you did? What were the thoughts you had? And how did you reach out? How did you deal with those emotions? Because whatever you're doing at 17 to cope is what you're going to be doing at 47 to cope if you don't ever do anything to change it. So we really try to empower young people to think about how they can help themselves, how they can seek help for themselves, and the things that they can do on their own. I know that for people who have mental disorders, obviously coping mechanisms are important for all people, whether or not you have a mental disorder, but for people who, like me, live with bipolar disorder or depression or anxiety, I think it helps to have some kind of system in place to be able to perceive early signs of not being well, so that you can make adjustments on the early end of things rather than on the catastrophic end of things when it's really hard to make a difference. And I know in my own life, have you guys seen the movie War Games? It's a 1980s movie with, Matthew Broderick. Okay. So for those of you who haven't seen it, War Games came out, I don't know, let's just say 1985. It was before we all had home computers. Matthew Broderick was in high school, and he had one of the first home computers. And he figured out how to somehow tap into this subterranean military operation where they were setting off global nuclear thermal warfare, I think is what they called it at the time. And so he figures out how to tap into it, and he accidentally trips it up, and he ends up beneath the mountain where they have the system of describing the level of threat from global nuclear warfare. And it's the DEFCON system. And I've been told by people that actually there is a DEFCON system, and that's what it's really called. And it's DEFCON 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I believe, when you're at 1, things are sort of fine. There's a very low level of threat from global nuclear warfare. And as you go up into 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 is like, the bombs are about to blow. And I think of myself in those terms. Right now, for instance, I'm at 1, and most of the time I'm at 1. Things are fine, and when I'm fine, I'm really like as functional as any functional person. I sleep well, I eat well, I get a lot done, I have good relationships, I have a good life. But as I veer off into 2, 3, and 4, the more quickly I can catch it and start making adjustments, the better. And that's really what has taken me basically 10 years to figure out how to do. And so I share my coping mechanisms not as a way of telling young people, you should do this too, but as a way of saying, you should figure out what yours are. For me, as it turns out, sleep is pretty important. Of course, doctors had told me that sleep was important when I was first diagnosed, but I went off to college where we were up every single night until 4 in the morning, and it just really wasn't very realistic advice to tell an 18-year-old to get a regular amount of sleep every night. And it really wasn't until my 20s that I figured that out and have been able to forego maybe, or just sort of to take care of myself and make sure that that happens. I figured out that running works only 2 years ago. I don't run very far, I don't run very fast, I'm sort of a slow, short distance runner. But it works. Running really 20 minutes a day, it helps me sleep, it helps certainly, there's that immediate endorphin kind of rush. But in general, I find that it just helps me manage and have a sort of sunny outlook on life. And again, this was something that doctors had probably told me, you should get some exercise, but it can take a while before you're at a place in your life where you're really ready to deeply take care of yourself and take good care of yourself. It's interesting that taking care of myself doesn't involve 52 things every single day. It's a couple of main ones, and if I do those things, things basically go well. So it doesn't feel like this humongous homework assignment every single day of my life to take care of myself. It really is quite manageable, but I remember the feeling at 17, that it was unmanageable, that it was too much to ask for, especially in the context of college when everybody else is as busy as they can possibly be destroying themselves around you. It really certainly didn't seem fair. It also just didn't seem realistic to ask me to do all these sort of self-monitoring things. Yoga is something that I got into in my 20s and found that it really, in combination with meditation, that it really connected me to my body in ways that were really important. A lot of people who suffer with depression and anxiety live in their heads, and yoga can get you out of there and into your body, where you can sense what you really need much more vividly and more realistically. So I'm always trying to get people who have never tried it to try it. In fact, this year, for Hanukkah and Christmas, my family is Jewish, I hired a yoga teacher to teach my whole family yoga, which was really hilarious. My father and my two brothers, are all sort of ex-athletes who haven't worked out in about a decade, and they went with me as it was really their gift to me more than my gift to them. But yeah, at one point I saw my whole family, in Warrior 2 down the line. It was like a very happy moment for me, a lovely thing to do as a family. And then, therapy. I got into therapy when I was 25, and I had tried before, but my level of trust had really been pretty destroyed, and I was pissed at almost every therapist I tried to see. If they didn't have bipolar disorder, I didn't understand how they could even think that they could understand me. And I also didn't have enough money to pay for it. So again, there were things that just were all presented to me at 17, but took me a while to get to and to commit to. But I had a wonderful therapist who gave me cognitive behavioral therapy, which again, I'm not pushing any one thing over another, but for me, that kind of therapy, because it involves a kind of coaching and practice, and I'm very coachable, was really appealing. And I saw success with it pretty quickly, and really, it really profoundly changed my relationships, mostly. It helped me deal with jobs and deal with group situations and build a sustainable, manageable, meaningful life. There's an interesting thing when I'm starting to go from DEFCON 1 to DEFCON 2 or 3. Retreats work for me, as long as they don't go on for too long. It helps for me to kind of go simple with, as much as I possibly can, cancel things, and retreat into my house, which I love, in Brooklyn, and make chicken soup. And I don't know if any chefs here in the room? Yeah. Well, for me, I think the reason why it works, and I've asked people what their tricks are for getting back into themselves, and a lot of times there's a sort of there's two things that they all have in common. One is that they're tactile, you're using your hands instead of your head, and the other is that they're process oriented. There's like a beginning, middle, and end. And I think when you're depressed, when you're anxious, there's this horrible, endless kind of cycle, relentless drone to the way that you're thinking, and a process that has a definite beginning, middle, and end can really help you get out of your head and into the world again. Other people have told me that gardening does the same thing for them, or constructing projects physically can do that. We try and tell kids to make a safe list of people that they can trust in their lives, people that they can call when they're not feeling well. This is something I still have to do, and the list changes from time to time. People I really, really can share myself with. I have a lot of friends, I'm a social being, but there's always only like 2 or 3 people in my life that I really can trust when I'm feeling depressed, because it's such a lousy, repulsive feeling state that it takes a whole lot of trust to reach out from there to another person. But I think the thing that's most helped me heal, and this is just in my case, it's not for everybody, but has been writing. I think that, I kept a journal since I was 5 years old, so I was always writing anyway. But for me, to get the opportunity to write down what had happened to me, write down what happens to other people, interview people, gather wisdom, gather meaning, and find new ways of expressing things that I'd never seen expressed before. It really was how I healed, how I made sense of the world again. And that's why it feels particularly good to teach writing, because I see that happening in my students. I teach an online memoir workshop, and over the course of the 6 weeks, people really do have these epiphanies, they have these breakthroughs, because the opportunity to make coherent and make meaningful the scraps of your own memory, it really is healing. And there's actually a lot of science behind that is pretty fascinating. I think more than anything, what's helped me and it has to do with the writing, is building a sense of acceptance that I have bipolar disorder, that this lousy set of things happened to me when I was a teenager, And I think my parents really helped me with that sense of acceptance. But for me, I think it helps to think about the things that bipolar disorder has brought to my life, the ways in which it's been an asset and not just taken from me. And I know that seems unlikely, but really at my worst moments, I have to remember that, you know, it's because of the things that happened to me when I was a teenager that I have the level of compassion that I have for other people's experience, which is one of the things that I really like most about being alive, is empathy, compassion, an ability to hear other people's life experiences and connect vividly and directly to them. I remember that bipolar disorder taught me how resilient I was. I really resented that at 17, but I don't at 34. I'm about to turn 34 next week. And, you know, all of that work that I had to do as a teenager to bounce back from this terrible set of events really did show me how deeply resilient I could be when tested. And, you know, you don't know at 17 that life basically gives you one sort of set of tests after another periodically. But that's really what happens, and I've found that over the last decade that I've just been more ready when things happen than many of my peers have been or could be. And I wouldn't trade that resilience for anything. I mean, that really is a prized asset, and it came from that experience. I think, obviously, in my case, I've had a lot of professional opportunities come from writing about what happened. You know, the book and working with MTV and working with HBO and all the various advocacy work that I've been able to do. So, I mean, that's really, in my darkest moments as an adult, how I make sense of it now. It's just that, yeah, it's not ever fun to get sick or to feel like just when you're building something, it's starting to fall apart out of your control. But there have been so many gifts to this life, to my life, to having this extraordinary set of circumstances and to the way that it's opened me up to other human beings. The things that we try to leave with kids is three main things. The first is just this idea of like, figure out what works for you. You know, you don't get to pick what happens to you in life, but you get to pick how you cope. And that's really one of our main messages when we speak to young people. And the second thing we talk to them about is how to contribute to your own community. I get asked to speak, I probably speak about a dozen times a year, sometimes more. And I was once asked to speak for the opening day of the Cleveland Hockey League. Because as all of you know, hockey and wellness are just, they go together like peanut butter and jelly. And I thought this was hilarious at the time, and I was bragging to my friends, I'm going to speak, you know, I'm going to speak at a rink, I'm going to speak at a hockey game. I thought it was really funny until I got there and realized, you know, this is serious business. These people have pucks, and they did not come to see me speak, and I better figure out some way of relating what I'm talking about to them. And that, of course, is the job, our job as advocates, is always how to cross cultures and bring the reality, the multiple realities of our lives as people with mental illness into a more normalized kind of viewpoint. And so I told the hockey fans, I'll share it with you, that being diagnosed with a major mental disorder is a bit like being the goalie in a hockey game. But instead of there being one team of people trying to score against you, there are three teams of people trying to score against you. The first team is the illness itself, which, if left untreated, can be catastrophically destructive to everything that you love in your life, everything that means anything to you in your life. The second team, as if it wasn't enough to have one team trying to score against you, is the mental health care system, which is pretty broken for many people. Obviously, we know that 45 million Americans don't have health insurance, and even those who do, you know, there still isn't real coverage for things like, you know, the kinds of things that I don't see any day where health coverage is going to cover all the things that are actually necessary for mental health, like therapy and yoga and chicken soup. They should pay for my chicken soup. In any case, the third team, as if it wasn't bad enough to have two teams trying to score against you is stigma. And it's really, it's pretty bad. It's in every corner and crevice of our, certainly of our culture, and it gets embedded into the minds of people who are newly diagnosed. And so what does our beleaguered goalie with bipolar disorder need? Certainly not our fear and certainly not our judgment. He or she needs our empathy and our respect for all that he has on his plate. And I think it's a message that people can hear. I think as soon as they meet somebody who has a major mental illness in their life or in someone in their family's life, everything changes. It's that contact that makes a difference. And so when you're talking to a friend who's been diagnosed, or in your case to a client, it's important to share those stories, to say, I met somebody with bipolar disorder who's doing quite well just the other day. She's fine. She has a career that she loves. She has a life that she loves. She seems to make a lot of chicken soup, and that seems to work for her. To bring up real examples of people can make a huge difference. Always sharing your own, any kind of relationship you have to it really helps. I remember going into my primary care doctor in my 20s, a new primary care doctor, and she looked at my chart and saw that I had bipolar disorder, and she said, I love people with bipolar disorder. My friend has bipolar disorder. She started yakking away about all these people in her life who live with it, and she was really serious. She finds us to be interesting people, and it made a huge difference to how I felt in her office. And then the last thing, obviously, for young people is for them to be aware of where the resources are, where they can send their friends when they need help. And that kind of resource is much richer than them all trying to scurry around and saving each other or therapizing each other, which doesn't quite work. The last thing that we try to get them to do is to start an Active Minds in their own high school or college. That's usually pretty successful. There's usually a gang of usually girls who want to start a group. Okay. A couple things I want to mention to you before I wrap up today. One is that I'm teaching a memoir class in April, starting April 18th, and it's online, so if anybody here wants to take it or anybody you know wants to take it, you can always get information about it on my website, which is lizziesimon.com. My email's there, and you can always email me for details. And the second thing is, as George mentioned, I'm working on a new book. I've been working on it for about 5 years, and it's called Soldier's Heart. In 2005, I traveled the country and interviewed young veterans of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq who had post-traumatic stress disorder, and I sort of followed their families ever since, really, for the last 4 years, to write about the impact of trauma on relationships and on families. And so the book, much like Detour, is kind of, there are memoir aspects of it. I'm writing about my own experience in relationships, and then I'm also writing about these families and the toll of PTSD and coming back on these families. And so I wanted to leave you with a bit from that book. Before I go, and I want to thank you. You've been a great audience today. Okay. We stand to gain because we can teach each other that we're not alone and that we're not freaks. We stand to gain because it is empowering to explore where our internal us-them divisions are, where our internal sane-insane divisions are, and to try and undo them. We can know each other and accommodate each other and help make each other both more free and more engaged in the world. I know how much diversity exists among us, but those of us who are concerned with these issues are not a marginalized minority. In fact, together we're an integrated, bipartisan, transcultural, multi-generational, economically diverse majority. I want us to start feeling like one, communicating like one, and taking action like one. Thank you.